They called him the mad genius. But then a dirty little boy stepped into the room, looked at the board, and whispered, "Are you trying to say goodbye?" Room 204 in Cobb Hall sat tucked behind ivy-covered walls where morning light rarely touched before 8. No one used this classroom anymore, except for one man who came in every dawn, like clockwork. Professor Richard Ellery, with white hair and a gaunt frame, entered as if attending Mass. In his shirt pocket, he carried a folded handkerchief and a worn piece of chalk. He did not come to teach. No students sat in the chairs. There were no syllabi, no grades, no explanations. Only him, the blackboard, and equations stretching like deep fractures across a dry earth. No one understood what he wrote. Those who tried gave up halfway. The symbols curved and spiraled like mazes with no exit. Younger faculty whispered about his breakdown. Some pitied him. Others rolled their eyes. But no one got close. No one asked. Richard never explained. He did not need witnesses. Each equation was a memory buried beneath layers of logic. Under his hand, nonlinear systems became language. They were not meant to be solved. They simply existed, like unspoken grief. That morning was no different. Chicago in December was bitter cold. Wind slipped through the halls, rattling the windows like distant breath. Richard arrived early, wiped the board with his damp cloth, and began writing again. There was something sunken in his eyes that day. Tiredness, patience, surrender. As his chalk paused at the final line, the wooden floor behind him creaked. Richard turned. A boy stood at the door. Messy hair, a paper-thin jacket, shoes without socks, red cheeks from the cold, but his eyes held a calm, unnatural stillness. Richard said nothing. He was used to silence. The boy didn't flinch. He walked in, pulled out the first chair in the third row, and sat down like he had always belonged there. No one had dared sit in those seats in a decade. But this boy didn't know that. Or knew, and simply didn't care. 1 minute. 2. The room stayed quiet, as if the outside world no longer existed. Richard waited for a question. But the boy didn't speak. He stared at the board, eyes moving slowly across the curves, as though reading a letter from long ago. Then, without looking up, he said, "Are you trying to say goodbye?" Richard stood still. The wind rustled behind him. Inside his head, there were no formulas left. That voice had not come from a math student. It came from someone who had lost something. Someone who understood silence better than speech. He stepped closer, studying the boy's face. No school badge, no backpack, no trace of belonging. Richard guessed he was 10, the same age Andrew had been when he died. "What is your name, Caleb?" the boy answered quietly, like it barely mattered. "Where do you go to school? I don't," the boy said. "My mom says staying alive matters more than homework." Richard nodded. That answer felt like a theorem he had proved 1,000 ways. In all those years no one had seen him. Sometimes survival was the only thing left to prove. "How did you get in here?" The door was open. Simple answer. But more truthful than any lecture. Caleb looked up at the board again and pointed at a dense curve between two main equations. "I like this part," he said. "It looks like someone trying not to cry. But you know, holding it in too long gets heavy." Richard could not look away. In his life, he had lectured to thousands. He had spoken on entropy, nonlinear modeling, chaos theory. But no one had ever read his equations like this. No one had ever seen them as emotion. Do you know math? No? But I know sad. The silence after that felt sacred, like the missing measure in a symphony Richard had never finished. The room became a chapel for things left unsaid. There was no bright light, only a small understanding slipping through the cracks. Caleb sat there a few more minutes, then stood. "Can I come back?" Richard nodded. No smile, no words. But for the first time, his eyes didn't shut the door. The next morning, the boy returned, and the next. Each dawn, before students filled the quad, before janitors clocked in, Richard and Caleb met in room 204. One wrote, one watched. No explanations, no need for understanding. After 3 weeks, Caleb picked up a piece of chalk. He did not write equations. He drew a purple line alongside each parabola, dotted circles beneath the discontinuities. Richard didn't stop him. The boy wasn't defacing the work. He was finishing it. Quietly. Clara, the academic assistant, passed by one morning and saw them through the window. She couldn't believe it. She had studied under Richard before the tragedy. She knew how strict he was, how protective of the board, and yet there he sat, silent, letting a nameless boy draw lavender curves beside rigorous proofs. She considered knocking, then stopped. In that early light, the chalk shimmered like a heartbeat. Clara backed away. She reported nothing. She wasn't sure what she had seen, but she knew it was not something to interrupt. It was something to preserve. Richard knew Caleb didn't know derivatives, couldn't define continuity or limits. But the boy knew when a line broke because someone was too afraid to speak. He saw feeling inside the bounds. He recognized absence inside the integral. Most of all, he wasn't afraid of pain. Each morning, before the board filled, Caleb would ask, "Where did you stop yesterday?" Such a simple question. But behind it was something Richard hadn't dared ask himself in years. Do I still want to continue that morning? For the first time in a decade, Richard didn't begin with an equation. He wrote on the board in a slightly shaking hand, "Andrew Ellery." Caleb said nothing. He simply placed his hand gently on the name. Room 204 no longer belonged to formulas. It had become the place where Richard began to breathe again. It was just a line, curved, almost lazily, like a question never asked. It rested beneath 2 larger equations, subtle enough to go unnoticed if you were chasing results, loud enough to hum in your chest if you had ever lost someone and didn't know how to say goodbye. That morning, the chalk squeaked a little as Professor Ellery finished drawing it. The rest of the board was filled with dense systems, partial derivatives, strange attractors, swirling diagrams that spun like galaxies on a collision course. But that line, the smallest one, was different. It dipped, paused, and then curled upward again. A return. Or a refusal. When Caleb walked into room 204, his eyes skipped past the heavy math and landed right on it. "I like that curve," he said. Richard, still holding the chalk, paused. He didn't ask why. He had stopped asking why the boy came each day, or how he understood what even doctoral candidates could not decipher. The only thing that mattered now was that he was here, that someone still looked, that someone still felt. "Why that one?" Richard finally asked. "Because it looks like someone almost walked away." "But didn't," Caleb said. "Like they almost gave up. But they turned back." Richard stood still, his hand resting lightly on the chalkboard. He did not remember drawing it that way, but now that the boy had said it, he could not unsee it. He could not unread the feeling he had unknowingly written into the math. And maybe, just maybe, that line was about himself. After Andrew's death, there had been no funeral speech from him, no obituary, no public appearance, only silence. The department covered for him. Articles stopped, emails went unanswered. His colleagues grew used to the emptiness around his office. But there had been one night, he remembered now, when he had stood in this very room, the windows fogged with snow, the board wiped clean, and he had written something. Something like that curve, something like an attempt to turn back. That same shape had followed him ever since. Caleb sat on the edge of the desk in the front row. He had stopped taking chairs lately. He preferred desks, like they gave him height, perspective. His knees swung gently, rhythmically, as if tapping out a beat only he could hear. "Can I try one?" he asked. Richard blinked. Try one what? A curve. He stepped up to the board, not waiting for permission, and drew a single sweeping line, nothing mathematically precise, just a soft spiral, like a shell or the way steam curls upward from a mug. Then he added a tiny dot near the center. "That's me," he said, "right in the middle of it. Not moving. But everything around me is spinning." Richard watched the boy draw. He noticed the way Caleb gripped the chalk, not like a student, but like a child holding a crayon. The marks were uneven, unsure, but they held something even a seasoned mathematician could not replicate. They held honesty. "Do you want to learn the real names for these?" Richard asked gently. "What for?" "So you can explain them better, maybe even write your own one day." "But I already do," Caleb said. "Just not in your language." Richard didn't respond. He felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, not sorrow, but something raw, a kind of awe. He had spent decades building proofs so perfect they collapsed under their own weight. But this boy, this untrained, unfiltered child, drew shapes that could not be graded, but also could not be denied. That afternoon, Richard did something he had not done in years. He brought in his old journal. It was a battered leather notebook, the pages worn soft from time and grief. Inside were notes from the last lectures he had ever given, unfinished proofs, abandoned theorems. But between the math, tucked away in margins and empty corners, were other things. Dates, names, sentences that never became letters. He placed the notebook on the desk in front of Caleb. "Want to see something no one else has?" The boy's eyes lit up. Together they flipped through pages. On one, a drawing of a curve interrupted mid-form with a single word beneath it: lost. On another, a formula blurred with an accidental coffee stain, labeled attempted. And there, between them all, a tiny scribble in the bottom corner. Andrew loved spirals. He said they looked like forever coming home. "Who's Andrew?" Caleb asked. "My son." "Oh." The boy did not offer condolences. He did not lower his head or speak in hushed tones. Instead, he traced the spiral with his finger and said, "That's why you write like this." Richard nodded. "You miss him. Every day." "Me too," Caleb said quietly. It was only then that Richard realized the boy wasn't just wandering campus out of boredom. He was running from something, or maybe toward something. "Where's your mom?" Richard asked. "She's around. Sometimes she goes away for a few days. She has things she has to do." Things Caleb shrugged. "Sometimes she forgets I'm there. But it's okay. I come here instead." Richard looked at him, this child who had no formulas, no books, no proper shoes, but who could read a man's heartbreak better than anyone in the faculty lounge ever had. The next morning, when Caleb arrived, the board was already full. But this time, it was different. Instead of dense, impenetrable walls of logic, Richard had drawn a single sweeping arc. No equations, no variables, just a shape. An incomplete circle, broken slightly at the top. Caleb stared at it. "That's not finished," he said. I know. Can I finish it? Richard handed him the chalk. The boy stepped forward and drew a small bridge between the two ends, a delicate line that closed the gap like a whisper connecting two silences. Then, in the center, he wrote a word. It wasn't a math term. It wasn't even capitalized, but it glowed on the board like a flame. Remember, Richard could not speak. For a long time, neither of them did. That night, Richard wrote in his journal again. Not a formula, not a graph, just a sentence. Someone is still reading. It had been snowing softly when Richard first told someone about Andrew. Not out loud, not in full, just in pieces, scattered like chalk dust across the blackboard. Until Caleb, no one had read the fragments as anything more than abandoned theory. But the boy had seen through the symbols. He had reached into the quiet, and now the quiet had started to reach back. Richard found himself doing things he had not done in years. He boiled water for tea instead of letting it cool untouched. He wiped the board with care rather than routine. He even paused to watch the sunrise filter through the narrow window slats of room 204 like golden threads weaving through shadow. Every morning, Caleb arrived a little earlier, sometimes with a bruise on his arm, sometimes with sleeves too thin for the wind. He never spoke about it, and Richard never pressed. The boy had a way of folding his pain, tucking it neatly into the corners of his words like origami. You would not see it unless you looked closely. That morning, Caleb was quiet. He sat cross-legged on the desk again, chewing on the tip of a pencil, watching Richard write. The board filled slowly, a steady rhythm of curves, slopes, and asymptotes. Richard did not rush. There was something delicate about the process now, like rebuilding a cathedral from memory. What happened to him? Caleb asked suddenly. Richard did not turn. To Andrew. He died, Richard said softly. A car accident. A rainy night. A distracted driver. That is all. Was he like me? No, Richard said. He was like no one. Caleb was quiet again, but not hurt. It was not comparison he sought. It was presence. He just wanted to understand the boy who had left this room before he ever entered it. Did he ever sit here? Caleb asked, pointing to a desk in the middle row. Yes. Did he understand what you taught? He tried. But I think he understood me more than he understood math. Like me, Caleb said. Richard smiled, a tired, almost invisible smile, the kind that had not crossed his face in years. Later that day, while Richard packed up his things, Caleb wandered to the bookshelf in the corner. It was an old shelf, half forgotten, stacked with yellowing journals and marked-up manuscripts. Most had not been touched since Andrew died. Hey, this has your name on it, Caleb said, pulling out a slim folder. Richard looked over. That was the last paper I submitted. Before what? Before the silence. Caleb opened it. The cover page was dated nearly a decade ago. The title read, Nonlinear Grief Models and the Geometry of Absence. This is about him, isn't it? Richard hesitated. It is about what came after him. Caleb sat down and began reading, lips moving slightly as he struggled through the terminology. Richard watched him, fascinated. Not because Caleb understood every word, he didn't, but because he read not for knowledge but for closeness. Every word was like a hand reaching back through time. I don't get all of it, Caleb admitted, but it feels like you were trying to prove something that couldn't be proved. Yes, Richard said, that nothing holds forever, that even the strongest structures bend under grief. Did you ever finish it? No. I folded it away. Caleb closed the folder slowly, reverently. Then maybe we should unfold it. The next morning, Richard brought something else. A cardboard box, worn at the edges, filled with notebooks, photographs, and things left untouched for too long. He placed it on the front desk. Inside, Caleb found the traces of a boy who once filled this room with laughter. A science fair ribbon, a paper airplane, a birthday card with shaky handwriting, and at the bottom, a folded sheet of graph paper with a curve drawn in colored pencil. The same curve Richard had unknowingly recreated on the blackboard weeks earlier. He liked drawing spirals too, Caleb whispered. He said they reminded him of music you could see. Richard nodded. He had a sketchbook full of them. He used to sit in the back of my lectures and draw while I spoke. I thought he was not paying attention, but he was listening differently. He was listening with his eyes, Caleb said. There was silence again, but not the old kind. This was not absence. It was reverence. "Can I keep this?" Caleb asked, holding the drawing. "Yes. Do you think he would have liked me?" Richard looked at him, really looked. I think he would have sat beside you and drawn in the same notebook. For a moment, the past and present overlapped. The room felt full, as if Andrew had returned, not in flesh, but in echo, in continuation. As the snow piled gently outside, Caleb took a piece of chalk and began his own curve next to the one Andrew had drawn all those years ago. It was not perfect. It wobbled and dipped unevenly, but it curved toward the other, as if reaching out. "This is mine," he said, "but it touches his." Richard felt something shift in his chest, a weight lift, not entirely, but enough. "You know," he said slowly, "when Andrew died, I stopped writing not because I had nothing left to say, but because I thought no one would ever read it again." "I'm reading," Caleb said. "You are." Richard walked to the window. Outside, students hurried through the snow, unaware of the small resurrection happening inside room 204. He wondered how many others walked past, never realizing that healing was a quiet thing, that it did not announce itself, that sometimes it looked like two curves touching in chalk. That afternoon, Caleb unfolded the last page of Richard's journal. The final line was unfinished. "What is this?" he asked. It was supposed to be the closing proof of a lifetime. "Can I write something?" "Yes." Caleb took the pen, and beneath Richard's last unfinished equation, he wrote, "Sometimes we do not finish, but we continue." Richard closed his eyes. He had spent a lifetime believing closure came from solving, from proving, from putting a box around pain and labeling it with theorems. But Caleb had taught him something else. That meaning was not in the solution. It was in the trying, in the sharing, in the continuing. That night, as Richard walked home through the snow, the wind cold against his skin, he no longer felt like a ghost walking through memory. He felt tethered, still grieving, still uncertain, but no longer alone in the room. And that was enough. The board had been clean that morning, not just wiped, but spotless. Richard had arrived earlier than usual, long before the sun broke over the Chicago skyline. He had stood in front of the blackboard in room 204, holding a piece of chalk without touching it to the surface. Just breathing. Just staring. It had been exactly 10 years. 10 years since the accident. 10 years since Andrew's voice had last echoed in this room. 10 years since Richard had spoken to his wife without something breaking in the middle of his sentences. He had spent the first year writing, the second year hiding. The next 8? He was not sure. Some years passed like fog. Some passed like wounds you learned not to scream about. Caleb entered quietly, as he always did now. The door did not creak anymore. He had oiled the hinges himself with a can he found near the janitor's closet. No one asked him to. No one needed to. Caleb had a way of making himself part of things without disturbing them. "You did not write anything today," the boy said. "No," Richard replied. "Not yet." "Are you going to maybe?" The boy set his backpack down. It was too large for his frame, second-hand, and stitched at the seams, but it carried a few pieces of fruit, a bent notebook, and the drawing he kept now of Andrew's spiral, always folded once and placed in the outer pocket. "Can I ask you something personal?" Caleb said. "Of course. Did you forget to pick him up?" The question was so quiet, so calm, that Richard almost thought he had imagined it, but Caleb was looking directly at him, not cruelly, not accusingly, just asking. Richard felt something deep inside his ribs collapse. "Yes," he whispered. "There was supposed to be a recital. I had stayed late at the department. One more meeting, one more proof, one more thing that felt important at the time." He waited. Then I forgot. Caleb did not look away. He did not flinch. He did not say it was not his fault. I was going to pick him up at 5. He waited until 6. He started walking home in the rain. That is when it happened. Caleb was still. "I think he forgave you," the boy said. Richard blinked. "How could you know that?" "Because I would." The answer did not fix anything. It did not undo time or bend fate, but it sank into the air like something true. Richard turned to the board. He picked up the chalk. His hand trembled. He drew a function, long, looping, with sudden breaks. It started cleanly, built upward, then dropped. A steep fall. No smooth curve, just a jagged plunge. At the bottom, it did not resume. It hovered, floated, unfinished. "What is that?" Caleb asked. "It is a function that stops mid-arc, with no continuation, no next." "But why?" "Because that is how it felt," Richard said. "Grief is not a curve you solve. It is a line that forgets what it was becoming." Caleb stepped forward. He studied the shape. He tilted his head. "I think there is a way to continue it," he said. "There is no mathematical extension," Richard replied. "I do not mean with math." He picked up a different piece of chalk. Purple. He drew a second line. This one did not try to replace the broken curve. Instead, it emerged beside it. Parallel, patient, like a hand reaching for another without needing to touch. "This one is me," Caleb said. "I am not fixing it. I am just walking with it." Richard felt his throat close. The boy was right. There are some equations you do not fix. You do not patch holes in grief. You walk beside them. You hold space for them to exist without demanding they be solved. Later that afternoon, Clara stepped into the room. She had not interrupted them in weeks, but this time her hands were full. A folder, a letter, a soft look on her face. "I thought you might want to see this," she said. She handed the folder to Richard. It was an invitation. The university wanted to host a lecture, a memorial lecture, for Andrew, 10 years later, to be given by his father. Richard sat down. "I do not think I can." "Why not?" "Because I have spent 10 years hiding behind symbols. Then maybe it is time to let someone hear the voice behind them." He said nothing. Caleb walked up behind him. "You do not have to explain everything," he said. "Just tell them why you started writing again." Richard nodded slowly. "Will you be there?" "Of course," Caleb said. "I am part of this now." Over the next few days, room 204 changed. It became more than a sanctuary. It became a workshop. Richard did not write proofs anymore. He wrote stories, reflections, visual metaphors wrapped in diagrams. each piece not designed to impress, but to connect. He drew the function of grief as a spiral collapsing inward, then slowly, over time, widening back out, not returning, not reversing, but growing with pain as part of it. He titled it, The Continuum of Missing. Caleb clapped. "That is how it feels," he said. On the day of the lecture, the room was filled. Not room 204, but a larger hall nearby. The seats were full of professors, students, and strangers who had only heard of the name Ellery through footnotes in textbooks. Clara stood in the back. Caleb sat in the front row holding the notebook they had filled together. Richard walked to the podium. He did not read equations. He spoke. He told them about a boy who used to sit in his classroom and draw spirals. He told them about silence and how it builds like snow if no one speaks through it. He told them about the mistake, the walk home, the absence. And then he told them about the boy who came in from the cold, looked at a curve and said, "I see what you are trying to say." He ended with this: "Some equations cannot be solved, but they can be shared. And in that, they begin to change." When he stepped down, the applause was soft, not thunderous, not overwhelming, but full, real. Later, when the hall had emptied, Caleb walked up to him. "You did it. We did it," Richard said. Outside, it had begun to snow again, just like it had 10 years before. But this time, they walked home together. Something shifted after the lecture. Not immediately, and not in ways that others might have noticed. The university carried on. Students rushed between classes. Faculty meetings remained as dry and precise as they had always been. The seasons turned as they always did in Chicago, with a bitter wind trailing the promise of spring. But for Richard Ellery, something inside him had moved. Not healed, not erased, but stirred, like a door creaking open after years of rust. He still came to room 204 every morning. That never changed. But now, when he wiped the board clean, it was not with resignation. It was with intention, with care, as though he were turning a page in something only he and Caleb could read. And each day he wrote, not equations anymore, or not only equations. Now the blackboard became something else, a diary, a canvas, a space for memory and meaning. He would draw a curve and write a sentence beside it. The loss was loudest in the quiet, a diagram of intersecting lines labeled, "What touches us once may cross again." And sometimes, without words, he would draw only lines, arcs, spirals, breaks, then step back and wait for Caleb to arrive. Because now, this space belonged to both of them. Caleb still came every morning, even on the days he had not eaten, even on the days his shoes soaked through from slush. He arrived with that same quiet steadiness, like a clock that ran on something deeper than time. Sometimes he brought his own chalk, purple, blue, soft green, and he added to what Richard wrote, not correcting, just responding. Under a descending curve, he wrote, "This is how it feels to fall and still hope." Beside a spiraling shape, he scribbled, "Maybe coming back around is the bravest part." Richard stopped seeing him as a visitor. Caleb was no longer the boy who interrupted the silence. He was the reason the silence had become something bearable. One morning, Richard arrived to find the room already occupied. Caleb was sitting at the front, staring at the blank board. "You are early," Richard said. "I could not sleep." Richard sat beside him. "Want to talk about it?" "Not really." "That is all right." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that no longer frightened either of them. Eventually, Caleb stood and walked to the board. He picked up a piece of white chalk and began to draw. But it was not a curve this time. It was a door. A simple rectangle, slightly open. He drew a small figure standing just outside it. And above he wrote, "Sometimes the hardest thing is not knowing if you are allowed to come in." Richard swallowed. He remembered that feeling. The first time he had tried to speak to another parent after the accident. The way he had stood on the edge of conversation, unsure if he still belonged in the world of the living. "You are allowed," he said. Caleb kept drawing. Inside the room, past the door, he added another figure, taller, waiting. Then he stepped back. "That is you," he said quietly. "Waiting. For who? For anyone who needed it to be you." Richard stood and looked at the board. In all his years of drawing functions, mapping out space and time, modeling human motion and machine behavior, he had never once drawn himself. Until now. "I think it is time you had your own notebook," he said. He reached into his bag and pulled out a fresh leather-bound journal. No markings, no titles. Just blank pages. "This is for you." Caleb took it with wide eyes. "I have never had one. It is yours now. Fill it with whatever you want, even if I do not know the right way. There is no right way. Just your way." That afternoon, Caleb sat in the corner curled against the radiator writing, drawing, sometimes pausing to stare at the chalkboard, as if letting the words gather in his chest before pouring them out. Richard watched him and felt something rise in him that he had not known he still possessed. Pride. Not the pride of a teacher for a brilliant student. Not the pride of a father for a successful child. But the pride of one soul recognizing another. They were, in different ways, survivors of something that had no name, something that left equations incomplete and rooms cold. But they had returned. Not to fix, but to remember. Not to explain, but to keep walking. One morning, Caleb arrived with a sheet of paper folded in his back pocket. "I wrote something," he said. "Would you like to read it aloud?" "No, but I want you to." Richard unfolded the page. It was a letter. Not long, not perfect, but full. It read, "Dear Andrew, I never met you, but I think about you all the time. I sit in your classroom. I talk to your dad. I draw next to your drawings. Sometimes I feel like I am just keeping your seat warm. But I think maybe you left it for someone like me. Someone who needed a place. Thank you for leaving a place. Your friend, Caleb." Richard read it twice. Then, once more in his head. He folded the paper and placed it in his coat pocket, near his chest. "Thank you," he said. It was the only thing that fit. That day the board remained untouched, not out of grief, but out of reverence. Sometimes even silence needed its turn to speak. On the first Monday of spring, Richard drew a curve that made Caleb stop mid-step. It was simple at first glance, like a wave rising and falling across the board. But the line dipped in ways that were almost too human, hesitant here, sharp there, then suddenly soft again, as if pausing before speaking. It was not part of any known function. There was no equation written beside it. No reference. No proof. It just was. Caleb dropped his backpack to the floor and stood in front of the board without saying anything. His eyes traced the curve like a finger running along a scar. "What does this one mean?" he asked after a while. Richard stood behind him, his hands folded together, chalk still in one of them. "I do not know," he said. "Not yet." "You do," Caleb said. "You just have not said it out loud." The boy walked up and placed his hand gently against the board, just below the first dip. It looks like someone trying to speak but choking on the words, he said. Like when you are about to say something hard, and then your mouth forgets how to move. Richard did not respond. His eyes were glassy, not with tears, but with memory. I drew this after reading your letter to Andrew, he said. I thought so. It is what I would have said to him, if I had ever been brave enough. What would you have said? That I am sorry. Richard's voice cracked. That I was not there. That I was distracted. That I thought I had more time. That I thought being a good professor was the same thing as being a good father. He stepped forward and drew a second line, this one starting from the end of the first. It did not follow the same shape. It was more direct, a little uneven. But it moved forward with a kind of trembling honesty. This one, he said, is the part I never got to say. Caleb nodded. He picked up his purple chalk and added a third line, smaller, curved like a question. It trailed beside Richard's, never touching, but always near. What does yours mean? Richard asked. It is me. Listening. The board now held something more than symbols. It held 3 voices, a silence, a confession, a witness. Over the next few days, Richard began something new. He created a series of boards, each with 1 curve, 1 sentence, and 1 response. He called them Conversations Without Sound. He never labeled them publicly, never explained their logic. But people started to notice. Clara was the first to linger. She came in one afternoon with a stack of papers and stopped mid-step. On the board was a single spiral, wide at the bottom and tightening toward the top. Beneath it, in chalky handwriting, were the words, "This is what it feels like to keep everything inside." And beside it, in smaller print, another hand had written, "Let some of it out. I am still here." She did not interrupt them. She never did. But before she left, she placed a note on Richard's desk. It read, "They are not equations. They are echoes. And you are not alone anymore." Caleb smiled when Richard showed it to him. "See," he said, "it is working." What is working? The talking, even when no one is saying anything. More students began to pass by room 204. Some peeked in. A few entered. No one spoke. But they looked. Sometimes they stayed a while. A few left notes on the desks. One student, a freshman majoring in architecture, left a drawing of his own beside a sketch Richard had pinned to the back wall. Another time, a teaching assistant left a page of calculus scribbled over with poetry. It had started as grief, but now it was becoming language. One morning, Caleb came in early, a little out of breath, eyes wide. "I had a dream last night," he said. Richard turned from the board. "What kind of dream? I saw your curve. The one about Andrew. But it was in the sky, like a cloud almost. I was standing in a field, and it just floated there. Was it moving? No. It was waiting. Waiting for what? For me to say something. Did you? I think so. But when I woke up, I could not remember what I said. Maybe you said it with something other than words. Maybe." Richard walked over and drew the dream on the board as Caleb described it. A curve in the sky, suspended, light but full. "And what would you write under it?" Richard asked. Caleb thought for a long time. Then he took the chalk and wrote, "Maybe you do not need to be fixed. Maybe you just need someone to stay." Richard stood still. The line, the words, the presence, All of it moved through him like music he had heard once, long ago, and thought he had forgotten. That night he wrote a new entry in his journal. He titled it, "The Grammar of Curves." He wrote about how grief folds itself into motion, how apology can look like a descending slope, how listening feels like a parallel line walking beside silence. And he ended with this: Caleb understands the curves better than any mathematician I have known, not because he can solve them, but because he sees what they are trying to say before they even finish speaking. The next day, Caleb brought in his journal. "I want to read you something," he said. Richard nodded. The boy flipped through a few pages, then held it open. "Sometimes I feel like I was not born with the right words, like I came into the world before they finished building the part of me that is supposed to explain things. So I draw. I draw when I cannot talk. I draw when I am angry. I draw when I miss people I am not sure I am allowed to miss. And this place, this room, it feels like a place where drawing counts, like it matters." Richard took the journal gently. "It does," he said. "It matters more than you know." He looked up at the board where 3 lines still hung, his, Andrew's, and Caleb's. Then he reached for the chalk and added a 4th. A slow, steady line rising upward. Not sharp, not sudden, just rising. "What is that one?" Caleb asked. "That," Richard said, "is what it feels like to start again." It began with a question Caleb did not mean to ask. They had just finished cleaning the board. Chalk dust floated lazily in the sunbeams, slipping through the tall windows of room 204. Outside, the trees were beginning to bloom, a slow defiance against months of cold. Caleb sat cross-legged on the desk, flipping through his notebook when he paused. "Why did people stop reading your work?" he asked. Richard looked up, a rag in his hand. "What do you mean, before me? You said no one really read it anymore." Why Richard exhaled. It was not that they stopped reading, it was that they stopped listening. He turned back to the board. "After Andrew died, I kept writing. At first because it was all I had left. Then, because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped." Caleb was quiet, his eyes steady. "And what happened?" "They said the math was too emotional, too abstract, too personal, that it was more memory than method, that I had let grief into the proof. But isn't that the point? That is what I thought. But they rejected the paper, all of them, one after another. I stopped counting after 6. Did you keep them? The rejections, no. The papers." Richard paused, then walked to the cabinet in the back of the room. It was old and stiff. He had not opened it in years. Inside were 3 binders, thick and worn. He pulled the middle one out and placed it on the desk. "Volume 2, he said. "The one I thought mattered most." Caleb opened it carefully. The pages were covered in spirals, broken curves, tangled equations wrapped around a center that could never quite hold. It looked more like music than math. "This one," Richard said, pointing to a diagram near the middle, "was the hardest to write. What is it I called it? The echo diagram. It models how pain returns. Not in a straight line, but in spirals, like a sound bouncing back in a canyon, each time softer, each time smaller, but never truly gone." Caleb ran his finger along the spiral path, and no one understood this. They understood it mathematically, but not humanly, so they ignored it. They buried it. Caleb looked up. "Then we should dig it up." The next day, Richard brought in a poster board. He redrew the echo diagram with fresh chalk, careful and slow. Caleb added color, shading each returning spiral a lighter hue until the last became almost invisible. Underneath, they wrote together, "Grief does not fade. It returns softer. And we learn to hear without fear." That afternoon, Clara walked in and stopped cold. She stared at the diagram for a long time, then approached without a word and placed a single sticky note beneath it. "This belongs to more than just room 204. Richard looked at her. "Do you think anyone would listen now?" Clara nodded. "Let me try." By the end of the week, the echo diagram had been photographed, digitized, and sent as part of a small article in the university's faculty newsletter. The piece was meant to be a quiet reflection, a simple note on how room 204 had become a space for healing through math and memory. They did not expect what came next. Emails. From students who had taken Richard's class decades ago. From professors across the country who had lost someone and thought they were alone. From a woman in Vermont who had no formal education in mathematics, but saw the diagram and wrote, "I did not understand the formula, but I recognized the shape. This is exactly what losing my sister felt like." And then, one morning, a letter arrived from the Mathematical Institute at Princeton. It was brief. "Dear Professor Ellery, we read your recent submission in the faculty bulletin at the University of Chicago. The echo diagram is among the most honest representations of nonlinear emotional return we have seen. If you are willing, we would like to invite you to speak at the annual symposium on mathematics and human meaning next month. Sincerely, Dr. Jonathan Wells, Institute Chair." Richard read the letter twice, then a third time. He handed it to Caleb without a word. "You should go," the boy said. "Do you think they really want to listen this time? Maybe. Or maybe they just want to understand why people keep coming to this room." Richard glanced around room 204. There were more drawings on the walls now. More curves, more words, more stories. The desks were rarely empty. Students dropped by just to sit in silence. Some came after class and left messages on the board. One student had written, "My dad never said goodbye, but this diagram helped me forgive the way he left." Richard closed his eyes. "I am not sure I know how to talk in a place like Princeton anymore." "Then talk like you do in here," Caleb said. "They are not asking for formulas. They are asking for you." 2 weeks later, Richard stood before a hall of mathematicians in New Jersey. His hands were steady. His heart was not. But when he spoke, he did not begin with numbers. He began with Andrew. He told them about a boy who drew spirals during lectures and said they looked like forever folding in on itself. He told them about silence, about room 204, about the chalk lines that became sentences when no words would come. And then he showed them the diagram, not as proof, but as presence. When he finished, the room was quiet, not stunned, not uncertain, listening. And in the front row, Clara sat beside Caleb, both of them smiling. Later that evening, Richard stood outside, the cool spring wind brushing against his face. Caleb walked beside him, holding his notebook. "You know," Richard said, "I do not think that diagram ever really belonged to me." "It did," Caleb said, "but it belongs to others now, too." They reached the corner of the street. The sky above them streaked with the first stars of the night. Richard looked at the boy who had once wandered into his grief like a trespasser and had stayed like family. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For seeing the curve before it was finished." Caleb smiled. "That is the only way I know how to look at things." Room 204 had changed. Not in structure. It was still the same worn classroom, with the same high windows and dark wooden desks. But something invisible had shifted. There was warmth now, not just from the radiator sputtering near the corner, but from the way people moved through the space. Like they belonged. Like it had become not just a room, but a refuge. After the symposium at Princeton, people began to reach out more personally. Some wrote letters, some showed up in person. A graduate student from Oregon traveled 3 states just to sit quietly in the back for an hour, then left without saying a word. Another visitor left a note under a piece of chalk that read, "You said what I never dared to. Thank you for making math human." Caleb read them all. He saved the ones he liked most in a shoebox under the desk he now considered his. One morning, Richard arrived to find Caleb already standing at the board, drawing something he had never seen before. It was not a spiral this time, not a single curve. It was a network. Lines intersecting, circling back, diverging, reconnecting. Some threads broke off, others looped and returned. In the middle was a simple point, surrounded by soft arcs radiating outward. "What is it?" Richard asked, watching the boy with quiet wonder. "It is a map," Caleb said, "of what, of how people carry each other, even if they never say so." He stepped back, brushing chalk dust from his fingers. "See, these paths here are like yours and mine. You walked in one direction, I walked in another. Then we crossed. And now we are walking side by side." Richard moved closer. The structure was raw, imperfect, but beautiful. "This one here," Caleb continued, pointing to a loop, "is someone who tried to leave but came back anyway. And this little one is someone who is too scared to move at all. But the others are close, waiting." He looked up. "I think people need a way to see how not alone they really are." Richard touched the board lightly, as if afraid the lines might vanish. "You should name it." The boy thought for a moment. "The map for those who walk beside." That same week, Clara printed a replica of the map and displayed it on a bulletin board near the entrance to the math building. Underneath, she included a short line from Caleb's journal. "Some people lead, some follow, but the bravest ones walk next to you and never let go." It spread faster than they expected. Within days, students began to leave marks on the poster. Tiny initials, dots, notes in the margins. One wrote, "I am here, still trying." Another, "I never said goodbye, but this helped me start." Someone pinned a ribbon beside one of the loops and labeled it, "My brother." Richard watched as the diagram transformed. It was no longer just Caleb's hand or his own. It was everyone's. One afternoon, as they sat together, Richard asked, "How did you come up with it?" "I thought about what it feels like to be lost," Caleb said, "and how sometimes it only takes one person walking next to you to make the path seem real again. Have you ever had someone walk beside you like that? Not until now." Richard looked at the boy's face, still young but marked by more weight than his years should have held. He wondered if he had ever asked about Caleb's home, really asked. Not just where he stayed or what he ate, but who held him when it stormed, who waited when he was late, who looked for him when he disappeared. "Do you feel safe?" Richard asked. The boy hesitated. "Here, yes. And elsewhere. Not always. Do you want to talk about it?" "Not yet." Richard nodded. That night, he could not sleep. He lay awake thinking of all the children who wandered through pain with no map, no witness, no person walking beside them. Caleb had drawn something many could see, but what about those who still did not know how to look? The next day, Richard came in early and began writing. He crafted a guide, not a lecture, not a theorem. A short piece called Instructions for Walking Beside. Caleb found it when he entered, written across the board in careful chalk. 1. Do not lead unless asked. 2. Do not push. 3. Do not interpret silence as absence. 4. Listen with your eyes. 5. Speak when it helps. Be quiet when it heals. 6. Stay longer than they expect. 7. Leave space for them to return. 8. Do not ask for a map. Become one. Caleb read it 3 times, then walked to the board and wrote beneath it, "This is the most beautiful math I have ever seen." They left the board untouched that entire week. By the following Monday, copies of the guide had spread across the campus. A philosophy professor printed it on the back of his syllabus. A psychology department requested permission to use it in their grief support training. Even the dean sent a letter saying, "You reminded us that knowledge is not just what we prove. It is what we hold, and whom we hold it for." Later that month, a local high school asked if Richard and Caleb would come speak. Not about equations, not about awards, but about curves and silence and walking beside. Richard agreed. He prepared a short talk, but let Caleb open instead. Standing on a small stage in front of students barely older than himself, Caleb held up his notebook. He said, "This is where I keep the things I do not know how to say. I used to think it was just for me. But then someone saw one of my drawings and said, 'I know that feeling.' And suddenly I wasn't alone anymore." He closed the notebook. You do not have to be perfect to be understood. You just have to be real. The room was quiet when he finished. A silence not of judgment, but of recognition. Richard stood beside him, and together they showed the map for those who walk beside. Afterwards, a girl approached with tears in her eyes. She did not speak. She simply opened her backpack, pulled out a small piece of folded paper, and handed it to Caleb. Later, when they were back in room 204, he opened it. Inside was a drawing, a spiral, faint and shaking, with 4 words beneath it, "This was my brother." Caleb did not speak. He walked to the board, drew a new line beside the others, and underneath wrote, "For the ones we still carry." Richard stood next to him, heart full, eyes heavy, and for a moment, neither of them felt like they were holding the world alone. Richard never intended to give another talk. After Princeton, after the map for those who walk beside, after the quiet girl with the spiral drawing of her brother, he had felt something settle inside him. Not closure, but enough peace to stop chasing the need to be heard. Then came the invitation from the university. A special event, they said. A series of presentations called Mathematics in the Human Mirror. They wanted Richard to open the program, not with a paper, not with equations, but with the story of room 204. At first he said no, not out of fear, but because he believed everything worth saying had already been said on the chalkboard, in spirals and echoes, in lines shared silently between him and a boy who had taught him how to feel again. But Caleb convinced him. "They need to hear it in your voice," he said. So Richard began to prepare. He spent evenings reworking the story, not to impress, but to bring people closer. He included the echo diagram, the listening guide, the letters, and most of all, Caleb's words. He practiced once, alone, in room 204. The board was clean. The room was empty. But in his mind, he could still see Andrew's desk, Caleb's purple chalk, Clara's folded arms leaning quietly against the doorframe. He did not expect what would happen next. 3 days before the event, Clara entered room 204, her expression tight, a folded paper in her hand. "It is not happening," she said. Richard looked up from his notebook. "What do you mean, your talk?" "They removed it from the schedule." Why? Clara hesitated. They said it was not rigorous, that it was more emotional narrative than academic contribution, that your diagrams are too interpretive. He said nothing. I am sorry, she added. Richard took the paper from her and unfolded it. It was the new event program. His name was gone. So was any mention of room 204. He folded it again, slower this time. It is not personal, Clara said. They just want to keep the focus on measurable content. He nodded, but his silence was different now. Not the silence of grief, the silence of recognition. He had been here before. When Andrew died, when his papers were returned unopened, when his colleagues smiled gently but closed their doors. He stood and walked to the board. Caleb had not arrived yet. He erased the diagrams, one by one. The echo spiral, the listening curve, the network of grief, the map. Clara stepped forward. Wait, what are you doing? If it does not belong in their lecture, maybe it does not belong here either. That is not true. He kept erasing. It was not anger in his motion. It was heartbreak, the quiet, exhausted kind that seeps in when you have finally allowed yourself to believe, only to watch the ground give way again. He finished and set the eraser down. I am tired, Clara. She said nothing more, and then she left. When Caleb arrived, the board was empty. He looked around. What happened? They removed my presentation. Why? Because I talked about people instead of proofs. Caleb walked to the board and picked up the purple chalk. Then let's start over. Richard shook his head. I do not think I have another start in me. But Caleb was already drawing. A small shape. A soft spiral. Just one. Then he turned and took out his notebook. There is something I never showed you, he said. He opened to a page titled, To the Man Who Let Me Stay. And he began to read. You let me sit in your classroom before I knew how to be in one. You let me draw on your board before I knew what any of it meant. You let me belong to something without asking me to explain who I was. You never asked me to prove anything. But you proved something to me. That people can be broken and still teach love. That silence is not absence. That grief is not the end of a sentence. It is just where the breath catches before the next line. When he finished, Richard could not speak. So Caleb folded the page and handed it to him. Post it, the boy said. What? Put it online. Let people read what they erased. Richard hesitated. They won't care. Some will, Caleb said. And that's enough. That night, Clara helped Richard type the speech into a short article titled, The Equation I Wrote to Say Goodbye. They included Caleb's letter, a photo of the original echo diagram, and a scan of the erased program with his name missing. They posted it quietly. No hashtags, no announcement, just a story. By morning, it had begun to spread. By noon, it had gone viral. Comments flooded in from around the world. A teacher in India wrote, I am using this tomorrow with my students, not as math, as medicine. A widowed professor in Canada wrote, I have never spoken about the child I lost. Until now. A teenage girl in Ohio shared, I do not understand calculus, but I understand what it means to miss someone. This made me feel less invisible. And then, among thousands of messages, came one from a former faculty member at the university. He said, I was on the committee that removed your talk. I was wrong. Your diagrams spoke more truth than any slide we approved. I hope you know, some of us are listening now. Richard sat in room 204, the light pouring in warm and wide. Caleb sat beside him. "So what do we do now?" the boy asked. "We keep drawing," Richard said, "and we keep letting people leave their names on the curves." That day, they redrew the map. They left room for more names, more loops, more returns. And on the board, in Caleb's handwriting, they added one more line. They tried to erase it. But truth has a longer memory than silence. The board in room 204 was no longer just a board. It had become a tapestry of curves, spirals, questions, and quiet offerings. No longer cleaned entirely, only softened at the edges to make space for new drawings. Each morning, the room filled with a kind of sacred quiet, like the hush before a song. People did not come to learn equations anymore. They came to see reflections of themselves. They came to remember. One April morning, a girl left a folded note on the windowsill. It read, "I lost my mother last year. But this diagram made me realize I never lost her completely. She just became part of the silence between my steps." Another student left a sketch of a broken line that slowly reconnected near the end. She wrote underneath, "Healing is not about becoming whole again. It is about staying close to what cracked you." Richard read each one. Caleb saved them in boxes. Clara began compiling them into a book. They called it The Curves We Carry. Richard never expected to begin again at his age, but with Caleb at his side, he felt time move differently. He was not rebuilding the past, he was anchoring something for the future. One afternoon, Richard turned to Caleb and asked a question he had carried for weeks. "What happens to you when you leave here?" Caleb blinked. "What do you mean? Where do you go when the sun sets and this room is empty?" The boy hesitated. "Sometimes a shelter, sometimes nowhere. Do you want to come home with me tonight?" The question hung in the air. Not as an offer of charity. Not pity. Just family. Caleb said nothing at first. Then he nodded. And in that moment, something shifted. Not a clean break, not a conclusion, but a gentle unfolding, as if a circle long incomplete had just found its return. That evening, they walked together through the quiet streets of Chicago. Richard's house was small, filled with books and quiet corners. Andrew's room had not been touched in years. The walls still bore pencil marks charting his growth. The bed remained neatly made. "Would you like to stay here?" Richard asked. "Is that okay? It would mean a lot." Caleb stepped in slowly. He did not touch anything, just stood in the doorway for a while, taking in the echoes. The next morning, for the first time, they arrived at room 204 together, not as teacher and visitor, but as something else. That day, the board was filled with names. Hundreds of names. Scribbled, initialed, symbolized, each one an offering, a trace of grief, a mark of return. Richard stood in silence, moved. How did this happen? Clara smiled. After the article, people began sending their names. Names of the ones they miss. Names of the ones they carry. I saved them all. We do not have room for them, Richard said softly. Then we make more board, Caleb replied. And they did. Clara brought in wide rolls of black paper and pinned them along the back wall. They extended the space. Curves spread across the surfaces like a constellation without edges. People came. A woman who had lost her son 30 years ago and never spoken his name aloud. A retired engineer who had never cried after his wife passed, until he saw the echo diagram. A student who had once tried to end her life, but said the map helped her stay one more day. Room 204 became something beyond what Richard had imagined. A cathedral built with chalk. That night, Caleb found a photo in Andrew's old drawer. It showed a younger Richard, Andrew laughing beside him, a beach behind them. Caleb studied the boy's eyes. He was not that different from me, was he? Not at all, Richard said. Caleb turned the photo over. On the back, Andrew had written, in messy black pen, "Dad always says curves are just truths with room to breathe." The next morning, Caleb stood at the board and began drawing. A new spiral, but this one had a center, a heart. Richard walked over. "What does this one mean?" Caleb looked at him. "It means I am not wandering anymore." They stood side by side as the sun rose. Later that day, Clara brought in the first bound copy of the book they had created. The cover read, "The curves we carry inside were stories. Diagrams, letters, drawings. No author's name on the front, just a quiet dedication on the last page. For anyone who has ever tried to say goodbye and needed someone to stay." They held a small gathering to mark the day. No speeches, no microphones, just a table with chalk and a board with space. One by one, people stepped up. They did not explain. They just drew. Richard stood at the edge of the room, eyes full, arms crossed gently. Clara stood beside him. "You gave us language," she said. "No," he replied. "I just remembered how to listen." Caleb was the last to approach the board. He picked up the purple chalk he had carried since the first day. He drew a final line. It was simple. A smooth curve rising, then leveling gently, as if coming to rest. And beneath it, he wrote, "I found where I belong." Then he stepped back. Richard walked to his side. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I would say this again. What you feel like my son." Caleb looked up. "And you feel like my home." Neither of them spoke after that. They just stood, side by side, beside a wall of names, of spirals, of echoes, and let the silence carry the rest. I did not write this story to talk about mathematics. I wrote it because some sorrows have no language, but still long to be understood. Because there are people like Richard Ellery who try to express grief through symbols the world mistakes for academia, when in truth, they are just trying to name what cannot be named. And there are people like Caleb, who may not have studied formally, but who understand what is left unsaid, simply because they have lived in silence long enough to hear the whispers of pain. I wrote this for those who have grieved quietly, without anyone knowing, for those who have tried to appear fine because they did not want to trouble anyone, for the children who sit in the back of classrooms, unnoticed, carrying something no one has dared to ask about, and for anyone who has ever stood before a blackboard of their life, unsure what to write, but still brave enough to stay and listen. Maybe you have not solved your own equation yet. Maybe you have not found someone to walk beside you. But if you are reading this, I want you to know, you are not alone. We are all unfinished curves, and sometimes the most beautiful thing is not the solution, but the fact that someone walked with us through the question. Thank you for coming this far. And if one day you see someone standing silently before a blackboard, try standing beside them. You do not need to say anything. Just let them know their curve deserves to be heard too. The author.